U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio visiting Israel on Monday promises unwavering support amidst the Gaza war. He calls for the elimination of Hamas, saying Gaza needs a better future. Prime Minister Netanyahu praises Rubio's visit as a strong message of U.S. backing. U.S. President Donald Trump is warning Israel, meanwhile, to be very careful in its actions against Qatar. He praises Doha as a great ally and describes Qatar's ruler as a wonderful person. Trump also urges the Gulf state to improve its public relations efforts. U.S. Treasury Secretary Bessent says the United States and China are very close to resolving the TikTok issue, but warns that national security will not be compromised. He claimed that Beijing has made an aggressive ask, while also stressing that overall relations remain strong at the highest levels. According to the Russian Defense Ministry, Russian air defense systems have intercepted 6 Ukrainian drones over Belgorod region. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has said that Ukrainian forces have advanced in border districts of northern Sumy region. Polish President Karol Nawrocki approves NATO troop deployment under Operation Eastern Sentry, as Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky warns Russia is testing NATO's eastern flank and offers to teach allies cost-effective counter-drone strategies to strengthen regional defense. Trilateral exercise Freedom Edge begins off Jeju as US, South Korea, Japan boost defense capabilities. North Korea condemns the drills as reckless show of strength, warning actions could bring negative consequences to participating nations. North Korea is declaring its status as a nuclear weapons state irreversible. Pyongyang is dismissing US calls for denuclearization as outdated and provocative. It insists its nuclear arsenal is essential to defend against American threats. A vigil was held in Washington honoring Charlie Kirk as US President Donald Trump says the shooting stems from left-wing, confirming investigations are underway, while lawmakers and officials condemn extremist violence and highlight Kirk's legacy. And beginning with news coming in at this moment, White House trade advisor Peter Navarro, who has been critical of India in the past, has said the country is now coming to the table, signaling progress in US-India trade discussions. Navarro indicated the talks are moving forward, opening doors for potential agreements on key trade issues between the two countries. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio has pledged America's unwavering support for Israel in its war against Hamas. Standing alongside Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Rubio said peace can only come once Hamas is eliminated and promised that Washington would keep maximum economic pressure on Iran to prevent it from developing nuclear weapons. Well, meanwhile, Netanyahu praised the alliance with Washington as stronger than ever, calling President Trump Israel's greatest friend in the White House. Rubio also acknowledged growing concern over Gaza's humanitarian crisis, saying the U.S. is not indifferent to civilian suffering. He defended a controversial aid distribution plan meant to bypass Hamas, while noting that Washington is open to alternatives. The remarks come as Israel presses on with its Gaza campaign, while international pressure is mounting over the humanitarian toll. Let's listen in to what Rubio had to say.
That's why the president continues with our campaign of maximum pressure. There will continue to be maximum economic pressure on Iran until they change course. That's why we are encouraged to see our partners in Europe begin the process of snapping back sanctions on Iran. They are clearly out of compliance with what was already a flawed deal to begin with. And we encourage them to continue down that road. We 100% support that. That is exactly what needs to happen.
Matti Zweig, geopolitical expert, is joining us live from Tel Aviv. Matti, what do you make of these statements made after the two leaders met? Marco Rubio, of course, on this visit to Israel after that strike in Qatar did cause tensions, not just in the Middle East, but all the way till the United States of America.
Well, thank you for having me. I think it's maybe a double message, but it's an important message. A message of unity with the ally, despite what government is it in Israel, is always an ally of the United States, despite all the, non-agreements that can be like these last developments of the last days, and maybe about the timing or about the way that was, but they are giving a clear voice of continue to be an ally and to have clear things like in the issues of Iran or about the need of avoiding any possibility of Hamas to continue being in power. From the other side, I think they have a lot of talks with the Qatar leadership to tell them that despite what happened, and they are not very really happy about that, but from the other way, I suppose they told them that they try only to harm Hamas and not the Qatari government. Despite that, this is also a message that they are not trusting Qatar anymore after all these years that they are supposedly mediating, but really are on the side of Hamas.
All right, Matty, appreciate you joining us with your perspective on that story. The Kremlin has stated that it is obvious that NATO is de facto involved in the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, citing both direct and indirect support provided to Kyiv. Moreover, the Kremlin has further asserted that NATO is effectively fighting Russia, calling it a certainty. This comes after former Russian President and Russian Security Council Deputy Chairman Dmitry Medvedev warned that creating a no-fly zone over Ukraine and allowing NATO to shoot down Russian drones would directly lead to war between the alliance and Russia. Medvedev comments come in response to Polish Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski's support for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Medvedev has expressed his concerns, calling the proposal a provocative idea from Kyiv and NATO. Andrew Latham, Professor of International Relations, is joining us live from Minneapolis on this story. What do you make of this statement issued by Dmitry Medvedev and his warning as well to the EU and NATO?
Well, it's sort of predictable at one level. Russia obviously has an interest in drawing a clear red line that the sort of proposed no-fly zone that comes out of Brussels and Washington periodically is a non-starter, and in fact is a casus belli. That would be a cause of war. So he's signaling that very clearly. No direct NATO involvement in this war, even against the backdrop of considerable indirect NATO involvement in this war. The irony there, or perhaps it's of a piece, is in both Poland and Romania in the last few days, Russia has deployed its own drones. And these weren't accidents. These weren't accidental crossings of the NATO frontier. These were deliberate elements of either a probing attack or a diplomatic signal or a salami slice tactic. But that's qualitatively different. NATO is entitled to shoot down Russian drones if they cross into NATO airspace. The Russian red line is, do not shoot down our drones if they're operating over Ukraine. We will consider that to be an overt act of war.
Yes. Also, Andrew Latham, after these comments, do you believe there will be any shifting in strategy by European countries, or are they unlikely to change their strategy at all based on these comments and this warning? In fact, this warning came after the Polish foreign minister's statement.
Yes, I mean, there is a redeployment of forces, Operation Eastern Sentry, so more non-Polish NATO members, their troops are now being moved, more troops are being moved to Poland. Again, to signal to the Kremlin that we're not going to put up with any incursions via air or land into NATO territory. So that's something of, I would say, an operational shift, not a grand strategic shift. The grand strategy remains the same. NATO was created to contain the Soviet Union, and now it's about containing Russia. That hasn't changed, but how they're going about it has changed. And the other element of that, of course, is the threats to confiscate, if that's the right word, Russian assets in Europe. And that, of course, is fraught, too, from a European perspective. There would be reciprocal moves on the part of the Russians, confiscating European assets in Russia. But it also sends the wrong signal to the rest of the world. Why would you have assets in the European Union or denominated in the euro, when the Europeans get irritated with you, they'll simply confiscate that. So I think that's an empty threat. I don't think the Europeans, in terms of your question about strategic shifts, I don't think they're going to double down on the seizure of Russian assets in Europe.
Okay.
It's just too counterproductive.
Okay, stay with us. In fact, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev has issued this warning to European states, saying it would take action against any nation attempting to seize its assets. This, of course, comes amidst reports that the European Union is exploring ways to leverage hundreds of billions of dollars in frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the US and its allies imposed sanctions, blocking transactions with the Russian Central Bank and Finance Ministry. As a result, approximately $300 to $350 billion, in fact, of Russian sovereign assets, largely consisting of government bonds, have been frozen, predominantly in European, US and British securities. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has reportedly pushed for the EU to find new ways to utilize these frozen assets, potentially to help finance Ukraine's defense against Russia. According to reports, the European Commission is also considering the possibility of using Russian cash deposits, including those from maturing bonds, at the European Central Bank to fund a reparations loan for Ukraine. So another warning being issued now by Dmitry Medvedev, this against using these foreign assets, which EU is threatening to do, Andrew, at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, this is a multifaceted conflict, and there are various tools, not just military tools on the ground and in the air, but these diplomatic tools, but also these economic tools, weapons, I should say, tools that have been weaponized. But again, I would underscore that Ursula von der Leyen, by the way, is pretty extreme out there in terms of the European leadership class. The European people aren't really in favor of this because they're tiring of this war, especially, across the board. But Ursula von der Leyen really is pushing the limits here. And I just don't think it's going to happen. What the proposed shift is not just freezing Russian assets, but seizing them and then diverting them to support the Ukrainians. So taking Russian money and spending it to support Russia's enemy. Obviously, this is a weaponization of economic relations, and it's one that the Russians, signaling indirectly through former President Medvedev, are simply not going to stand for. If it happens, which I don't think it will, the Russians will retaliate. And not only will they retaliate directly, but I think they'll try to mobilize the global South by saying things like, do you really want to invest in Europe? When something you do domestically or a conflict you get involved in will trigger them and they will confiscate your assets and maybe redeploy them to support your enemies. I mean, this is very counterproductive. The United States isn't doing this in a very direct way because it would feed the de-dollarization dynamic that's taking place. Why denominate your assets in US dollars if Washington can confiscate them when you irritate Washington? It's just in 2025, I think it's a non-starter as a strategic move.
Okay, and do you believe, though, that this is a move that is going to be contemplated by the European Union? Are they going to look at other such economic measures as well to try and pinch Russia economically at this juncture as well?
Yes, but the challenge is that the two Europe and Russia are too interdependent. Russia needs, by hook or by crook, through the front door or the back door, needs Russian oil and gas. And it's not going to cut that back because the cost, monetary, but also in terms of political support, would simply be too high. They're not going to seize and redeploy these Russian assets. Freezing is one thing. Seizing and redeploying is something else. They're not going to do that because the cost would exceed the benefits, both economically and diplomatically and in terms of the domestic politics at home. I see this, I've been wrong before, and I could be proven wrong here. But if I'm reading the tea leaves, what I say is this is a non-starter. This is Ursula von der Leyen doing what she's prone to do these days, which is, to use a term Bart, bloviating.
All right, stay with us. In fact, we're turning now to more news as well coming in. The Belarus Defense Ministry has said that representatives of 23 countries, including 3 members of NATO, US, Turkey and Hungary, have observed ZAPAD 2025 drills in Belarus. US military officers have paid a surprise visit to Belarus and observed joint war games between Russia and Belarus. The US officials were told by the Belarusian Defense Minister Viktor Krenin that they could look at whatever was of interest to them. Russia and Belarus began the ZAPAD 2025 exercise at training grounds in both countries on September 12th. The Russian Defense Ministry has said that ZAPAD joint strategic exercise aims to improve military command and coordination in the event of an attack on either Russia or Belarus. Moscow and Minsk have said the exercises are exclusively defensive and they did not intend to attack any NATO member, though NATO announced an Eastern Sentry operation after the incursion of Russian drones into Poland last week. The presence of U.S. officers is the latest sign of warming ties between Washington and Belarus. The U.S. had earlier also granted sanctions relief to Belarus's national airline, Belavia, in return, allowing it to buy components which included the Boeing aircraft. Andrew Latham, Professor of International Relations, is live with us on this story. Andrew, what is to be read into this surprise visit by United States officers to Belarus and what they found there?
Well, first of all, with respect to what they found was Russia demonstrating, this is deterrence via optics, Russia demonstrating new hypersonic missile capabilities and various other new techniques and technologies. But the really interesting thing from my perspective is an historical piece, that these observers were on the ground via the institution known as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It used to be the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. It's a product of the Cold War. You think back to the mid-1980s, NATO staged a massive exercise called Able Archer. And the Russians interpreted this as NATO getting ready to invade the Warsaw Pact and began to mobilize. And it was a crisis in the same league as the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, or the Berlin Crisis. It brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. And so what was instituted around that time and became institutionalized after the Cold War was any country on either side of that old divide that's going to have a major military exercise, it will invite foreign observers to make sure, to reassure everybody that it is merely an exercise and not a prelude to some direct military action. So the institution seems to have both persisted. It's still around, even though the Cold War and the post-Cold War era are long over. And it seems to be doing its job. American observers on the ground could verify that this wasn't Belarus getting ready to invade. This was something different, something, as I said, deterrence optics, if I can put it that way. So we can strike that up as a success for our Cold War and post-Cold War forebears. They had great foresight.
All right, Andrew Latham, appreciate you joining us with your perspective on that story. Meanwhile, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva has defended the trial that sent former President Jair Bolsonaro to more than 27 years in prison for plotting a coup. Lula had called the verdict historic and rejected Donald Trump's claim that it was a witch hunt. He said the trial safeguards Brazil's institutions and democratic rule of law. Lula also criticized Trump's 50% tariff on Brazilian imports, calling it misguided and illogical. He insisted Brazil is open to negotiations while maintaining its democracy and sovereignty. Sharad Kohli, economist, is live with us on this story. Sharad, what do you make of this latest statement by the Brazilian president on the verdict that has sent Bolsonaro to jail?
Well, I think Bolsonaro was always a darling of America, and he fitted the ideology which President Trump follows right now. So it suited him, and the moment there was a change, and when President Lula came in, I mean, there were cases which are opened, and he's been sentenced to several years in jail. And obviously, America is upset about this, that their close ally, their friend, is now going to be in jail. In fact, a lot of circles say that one of the prime reasons for tariffs on Brazil has been President Bolsonaro's imprisonment and now jail, the action being taken on him. Well, President Trump doesn't want him to do that. Well, we should not forget, and I think that America does a very large trade with Brazil. In fact, the total trade amount is about $94 billion. And, there are very substantial items and very, very important items being imported by America at this point of time, which include minerals and fuels, there's iron and steel, there's coffee, there's a lot of things coming from Brazil. So President Trump, by levying 50% tariff, we should not forget that along with India, Brazil is the other country which has been slapped with 50% tariffs. And I think tariffs are being used as a weapon, whereas the case in India, he said that probably India is, importing Russian oil. And of course, there were other issues. But then the additional tariffs were levied because of the import of Russian oil, whereas for Brazil, I think it's former President Bolsonaro seems to be the reason. So he's trying to weaponize, tariffs for anything and everything. He's seen probably tariff is the solution, but the law is taking its own course as far as Brazil is concerned. I think the Brazilian Supreme Court has ruled, that imprisonment for President Bolsonaro, and he will have to go through it. Meanwhile, President Lula, is a great friend. President Lula is a very active member of BRICS also. He's been supporting. He wants to come together with India, Russia, China, and in this whole trade war against America. So I think this is going to be a very interesting case going forward, because the Brazilian Supreme Court, whether it gets dominated by America, whether President Trump interferes, or shall I say Trump administration interferes in the judiciary of Brazil, and it interferes in the political circles of Brazil, I think will have to be seen in the days to come, Uday.
Right. Also, Sharad, as far as, of course, these tariffs are concerned, do you believe then perhaps they are a direct reason of the Bolsonaro trial? Of course, we are seeing how Lula has said that he's open for negotiations. He's once again said that it's unfair. Do you believe that these statements by Lula will have any effect on the US relooking at these 50% tariffs on Brazil?
Well, I think the condition for negotiation would be a release of and taking back the cases against former President Bolsonaro, which I really don't think President Lula is going to agree, because he would say that the law is taking its own course. It's the Supreme Court of Brazil which is calling shots. It's not the politics which is calling shots. It's the former deeds of President Bolsonaro which has led him into this situation. So whereas you see a starking difference between the negotiations with India, whereas for India, it wants us to stop, importing Russian oil. Whereas for Brazil, it wants President Bolsonaro to be a free man. He wants President Bolsonaro to be reinstated as president, given to left to Donald Trump administration. They would want Bolsonaro to be back in the fray. Whereas President Lula has been elected and lawfully elected, democratically elected. And I really don't think, something is going to come out. President Lula has obviously at diplomatic level, you have to show your willingness to negotiate. Because if President Trump agrees to anything short of, not releasing President Bolsonaro or dropping the cases against President Bolsonaro, President Lula would be open. But if it comes down to letting off criminal charges, dropping the criminal charges, I really don't think President Lula would have any say as far as the Supreme Court is concerned. Well, another set of circles say that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Brazil has been not been one of the favorites of America, and so there's a lot of things moving around. I think we'll have to wait and see as to how these negotiations shape up, Uday. I really don't think President Trump is going to really yield unless cases are dropped against President Bolsonaro.
All right. Appreciate you joining us, Sharad, with your perspective on that story. The Chinese Foreign Ministry in a press briefing has expressed strong dissatisfaction over comments from the de facto US Embassy in Taipei. Earlier, US Embassy statement had claimed that China intentionally mischaracterizes World War II era documents to pressurize and isolate Taiwan. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian asserted that the Cairo Declaration and Japan's surrender confirmed China's sovereignty over Taiwan. This statement comes as China celebrated the 80th anniversary of victory in World War II with a massive parade in Beijing. The dispute is a result of a series of claims and counterclaims regarding World War II victory from both Chinese and Taiwanese sides. Let's in fact listen in to what Chinese spokesperson had to say. All right, we will play out that soundbite for you later. But let's quickly turn our focus to some other news. The 77th Primetime Emmy Awards lit up Los Angeles last night, delivering a record-breaking and emotionally charged celebration of television's best. CBS's Late Show with Stephen Colbert scored its first Emmy for Best Talk Series as it heads into its final season. The show beat out Jimmy Kimmel Live and last year's winner, The Daily Show, marking the first time a broadcast late-night program has taken the award since 2015. Colbert thanked CBS and his team, reflecting on the past 10 years and the impact of his late-night comedy.
I just want to say, finally, go Birds and free Palestine. Thank you.
Okay, that was not Stephen Colbert's soundbite there, but we will, of course, play that out for you as well later. But meanwhile, Hack star Hannah Einbinder won her first Emmy for Outstanding Supporting Actress in a Comedy Series. During her acceptance speech, she made headlines by shouting "Free Palestine" and criticizing ICE, expressing support for a humanitarian response in Gaza. And that's all the time we have on this particular news broadcast. We will be back with lots more updates on the other side. Don't go anywhere.